One of these sous vide steaks will cook 4 times faster. For decades, sous vide has been the go-to method for precise, consistent cooking. But it has a major drawback. It's slow. But sous vide doesn't always have to be slow. And today, we're going to look at how to make it go faster. 4 times faster. Think of this as sous vide 2.0 or sous speed. And to understand how, why, and when it works, we need to briefly talk about how sous vide 1.0 works and why it's so slow. If you don't know what sous vide is, it works like this. Pick the temperature of the doneness you want, drop the food in water heated by a sous vide circulator, and let it cook. The water is at just the right temperature, so the food can't overcook. And when it's ready, just sear and then serve it up. But if you're just trying to get a meal on the table for weeknight dinner, waiting an hour or more for the meat to heat all the way through can be infuriating. Sous vide 1.0 is slow because it works by setting the temperature of the water to the doneness you want and then waiting for the food to come up to that temperature. Since the food can't get hotter than the water, it can't overcook, at least not in the conventional sense. The downside is it takes a long time, with those last few degrees taking up to 60% of the total cooking time. Why? Because heat flows into food based on the difference in temperature between the food and the water. So as the food gets closer to the water temperature, the flow of heat slows to a trickle. So the core of an 1.5 inch thick steak like this one takes more than 2 hours to equilibrate to the bath temperature. That's a lot slower than conventional cooking techniques like pan roasting or grilling, where the difference between the cooking temperature and the steak is much greater, so heat flows in faster. Of course, this does come at a cost. You have to time things just right, anticipate carryover cooking, and even then, you don't get that edge-to-edge evenness that's a hallmark of sous vide cooking. If you're willing to be patient, sous vide will reward you with perfect food every time. But here's the thing. It's possible to make sous vide go faster, at least for tender cuts of meats and seafood that don't need hours or even days of slow cooking. In Modernist Cuisine, we wrote about a simple trick we used at the Fat Duck restaurant to shorten sous vide cooking times. We just raised the water bath temperature a couple of degrees. Raising the bath temperature just 2 degrees Fahrenheit cuts the heating time by about 10%. Doesn't this overcook the food? No, not really. Because for most of the cooking time, the surface of the food is a lot cooler than the surrounding water. This might surprise you, but it's because as heat from the water arrives at the surface of the food, it's quickly handed off to the cooler core, which keeps the surface temperature cooler than the water. It's a bit like when you're in a hot bath. Your body is cooling the hot water against it, lowering its temperature and keeping your skin cooler than the water around it. It's hot, but not too hot, at least for a while. Eventually, your skin warms up enough to stop cooling the water and you start to overcook. That's when it's time to get out. So in the restaurant, as long as we roughly timed when to pull the meat out of the overheated sous vide bath, we could shorten the cooking time and serve the food sooner, without an overcooking penalty. Win-win, right? And this got me to thinking, wouldn't it be nice if you could know exactly how much you could turn up your sous vide bath and when precisely it was time to turn it back down? Well, you can. There are 2 ways I know of to do this. One is the most sophisticated cooking algorithm that has ever been developed. And the other takes the easy way out, but is actually more universal and even faster. Back in 2014, when we were designing the first generation Joule sous vide circulator, I had a hunch that we could use some clever math to figure out just how much we could spike the cooking temperature at the start and precisely when to cut the power and let the temperature of the bath drop to the selected doneness. So cooking goes faster, but there's still no risk of overcooking. While the idea was simple, making it work turned out to be really complicated. It took my colleagues Dr. Douglas Baldwin and Kevin Clona years to work out the math. Nearly a decade later, it has finally been released by Breville, the new owners of Chef Steps and Joule, as the defining feature of their new Joule Turbo sous vide circulator. Here's how it works. Joule Turbo needs to mathematically model how the water and the food heat. So the app needs some information about what you're going to cook. Specifically, it needs to know what food you're cooking, its thickness, and its weight. Then, as the food starts cooking, it gathers even more information. Since it knows how much power is being put into the water and the current temperature of the water, it can do some pretty hardcore math calculations to figure out a number of things, like how much water is surrounding the food, how much heat is being lost to the environment through convection and evaporation, and is the container metal or plastic? Next, Joule Turbo simulates hundreds of different ways it could cook your food and tries to pick the one that gets your food done the fastest. Seems like a lot just to cook dinner, right? But it really does work. Here are two identical 1.5-inch thick steaks cooked with and without turbo. It took nearly 120 minutes for the conventional sous vide steak to reach my preferred doneness. But it only took 53 minutes for the turbo steak to reach the same doneness. I know what some of you might be thinking. Weighing and measuring your food is a little bit fiddly, especially if you're rushing to get dinner on the table. I think that's a fair criticism. Joule Turbo needs you to provide all of these details because it doesn't actually know what's going on in the food as it cooks. If it did, making sous vide go faster would be a lot easier. What if, instead, you just measured the temperature of your food as it cooks and then adjusted the circulator accordingly? Well, you can, and that's the other approach to Sous Vide 2.0. And it works with any sous vide circulator you happen to have, like this one from Anova. Here's how. Say I want this steak cooked to about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll start by setting my water bath 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter to 150 degrees, and then drop my steak. This mimics Joule Turbo spiking the temperature to speed cooking. The tricky part is knowing when to drop the bath's temperature. Joule Turbo uses a lot of math to figure this out. But again, you can just use a thermometer. As the steak cooks, I'll just press my thermometer against the surface to check the temp from time to time. I want to see it about 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than my target doneness. Why let the surface get hotter than the doneness you want? Doesn't that defeat the whole point of sous vide cooking? No. If I measure the temperature just a few millimeters below the surface, you'll see that the steak's temp is still below the doneness I actually want. It hasn't overcooked at all. Since I'll be searing the steak later, it doesn't matter if the surface gets a little bit hotter. It's going to get searing hot anyway. And this little bit of extra temperature gradient is what makes sous speed work. Once the surface is up to temp, I'll just drop the bath a couple of degrees above my target temperature and quench it with some ice to keep things from overshooting. Then I just wait for the steak to finish cooking through. Which hints at the other challenge. How do you know when the core is up to temperature? Joule Turbo uses a lot of math to figure this out, and it does a really good job. But you can just use a thermometer to check that too, by poking the core periodically to check its doneness. If you're cooking the same foods frequently, you'll get a sense of how to time things just right with practice. And if you're in a restaurant, I'd actually recommend having 2 baths, a heating bath and a holding bath, so that you can just move the food from one to the other once the surface comes up to temperature. But this is all very easy to do with the wireless combustion predictive thermometer. You could say it was designed to be uniquely capable of doing this job. Aside from being wireless, it has 8 temperature sensors that automatically find and measure both the food's true core temperature and uniquely the surface temperature. And the new 2nd generation predictive thermometer is nitrogen flushed and sealed with a ceramic to metal bond to create a permanent hermetic seal. So you can just seal the food with the predictive thermometer, then drop it in the bath. And use the app and display to keep an eye on both the surface and core temperatures. Once it's done, pull the steak, give it a sear, and enjoy. In this case, it took less than 30 minutes instead of 120 minutes to cook this 1.5-inch thick steak. That's twice as fast as Joule Turbo and 4 times faster than conventional sous vide cooking. And the steak looks and tastes delicious. And all I had to do was start the cooking in a water bath at a relatively high temperature and then turn it down partway through cooking so that the food won't overcook, just like conventional sous vide. The overcooking beneath the surface is minimal, about the same amount that's going to be overcooked by searing anyway. This technique is obviously less set it and forget it than conventional sous vide, but it also cooks tender cuts of meat and seafood up to 4 times faster. which makes sous vide a lot more practical for me when I need a quick weeknight win. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. That's all for today, and thank you so very much for watching.